My name is Cassandra Hayes, but most people who know me, the few who truly do, call me Cassie. I grew up in a small gray-skied suburb of Seattle called Renton, in a modest split-level house that always smelled faintly of damp earth and my mother's pot roast. My father, Arthur, spent 40 years as a foreman at the Boeing plant, a man whose hands were calloused and whose beliefs were forged in steel and certainty. My mother, Helen, orchestrated our lives with quiet efficiency, her love measured in perfectly folded laundry, and a deep-seated fear of anything that strayed from the well-trodden path. For them, life was a simple linear equation. High school, a sensible degree from a state college, a stable job with a pension, marriage, and a mortgage. It was a good life, a secure life, and it was the only life they understood. My older sister, Clara, had solved their equation perfectly. She became a registered nurse, married her high school sweetheart, and bought a house just 3 blocks away from them. She was their pride, the proof that their formula worked. I was the variable they could never solve for. I wasn't difficult or rebellious in the traditional sense. I was just different. While other kids were playing sports, I was teaching myself to code on a clunky desktop computer my dad brought home from a surplus sale. The hum of the hard drive was a symphony to me. I saw the world not in straight lines, but in branching algorithms, in elegant loops of logic and possibility. The internet wasn't a distraction. It was a universe. I tried to explain it to them, showing them the small programs I wrote to organize my mother's recipes, or the simple websites I built for neighborhood businesses. They would smile, a thin, perplexed smile, and say, "That's nice, honey," the way one praises a child's macaroni art. They saw a hobby, not a calling, a phase, not a future. The rift, which began as a hairline crack, widened the day I told them I was leaving the University of Washington. I was 2 years into a business degree I loathed, my spirit withering under the fluorescent lights of lecture halls where professors droned on about theories that felt a century old. "I'm not dropping out," I tried to explain over a tense Sunday dinner. The pot roast sat heavy in my stomach. "I'm dropping in. Into the work I'm already doing. I have clients. I'm building something real." My father placed his fork and knife down with a deliberate clatter. "Building what, Cassandra? Little websites. That's not a career. It's a game. You're throwing away a 4-year degree your mother and I have scraped and saved for." "It's more than that, Dad," I pleaded, my voice small. "It's about creating systems, about connecting people. There's this idea I have for a platform that helps small artisanal businesses, like the ones at Pike Place, reach a global market without being swallowed by giants like Amazon." My mother sighed, her hands twisting a napkin in her lap. "But what about the security, Cassie? The benefits? A pension? What you're talking about, it's all just air. It's not real." That was the word they always came back to, real. Their world was tangible, touchable. A degree was a piece of paper you could frame. A pension was a check that arrived every month. My world of code, of digital architecture and global networks, was as insubstantial as smoke to them. The conversation ended, as it always did, with their disappointment hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. I did leave college. I moved into a tiny studio apartment in Capitol Hill, surviving on ramen noodles and the fierce, burning passion for the world I was building on my screen. The distance between my world and theirs grew from miles into light years. For 5 years I lived in that gap. I visited for holidays, my presence a constant, low-level source of tension. I try to share my small victories, landing a significant project, hiring my first part-time collaborator. They would listen with polite disinterest before changing the subject to Clara's promotion or the new siding on their house. They loved me, I believe, in the only way they knew how. But they didn't respect me. And the part of me that was a dreamer, a builder, an innovator, that part of me they did not love at all. They feared it. Which brings me to that last Tuesday in October. The air was crisp, smelling of rain and fallen leaves. I had driven to Renton for what my mother had called a simple family dinner. It had been months. I had just that very morning finalized a seed funding round for my company, Viridian Dynamics. It wasn't a staggering amount by tech standards, a little over $500,000, but it was everything to me. It was validation. It was the beginning. I was practically vibrating with the news, foolishly hoping that this time, this tangible proof of success, might finally bridge the chasm between us. I sat at the familiar oak table, the wood worn smooth by decades of family meals. I wore jeans and a simple sweater, my hair still damp from the Seattle drizzle. I waited for a lull in the conversation about their neighbor's new SUV before I took a deep breath. I have some news, I said, trying to keep my voice even. The company, Viridian. We closed our first round of funding today. Clara, ever the diplomat, smiled. Oh, Cassie, what does that mean? It means investors believe in my vision, I said, looking at my father. They've given us the capital to hire a full team to scale the platform. It's a big deal. My father's expression didn't change. He chewed his food slowly, deliberately. Investors, he said, the word tasting like something foreign and unpleasant. So you're in debt to a bunch of suits. No, Dad, it's not debt. It's equity. They own a small piece of the company now, but they're partners. They're helping us grow. Grow what? He scoffed, his voice rising. You're 26 years old, Cassandra. You live in a shoebox apartment, you don't have a degree, and you spend your days hunched over a laptop in coffee shops. Clara has a home, a husband, a real job where she helps real people. Each word was a stone, and I felt the wall around my heart, the one I've been carefully building for years, begin to crumble. My mother jumped in, her voice pitched with anxiety. He's just worried, dear. We just want to see you settled. This computer business feels so flimsy. Like you're pretending. One day it will all just disappear, and you'll come crawling back to us with nothing. Crawling back. The words escaped me in a whisper. I looked from my father's stony face to my mother's pleading one, to Clara, who was staring at her plate, refusing to meet my eyes. In that moment, the years of quiet disapproval, of being treated like a misguided child, coalesced into a single sharp point of pain. They didn't see me. They had never seen me. They saw only their own fears, their own rigid definition of a successful life, and my failure to fit into it. My father stood up then, his face flushed, the veins on his neck standing out. The quiet disappointment had finally boiled over into rage. It was the rage of a man who felt his authority, his entire worldview, being challenged by his own child. I'm done with this fantasy, he boomed, his voice cracking. He pointed a trembling finger at the front door. If you want to live in your make-believe world, fine. But don't bring it into this house. Get out. We don't need a deadbeat dreamer polluting this family. The silence that followed was absolute. It was deeper than the absence of sound. It was the absence of love, of support, of everything a home is supposed to be. I looked at my mother. She stood behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her chin set in a firm, affirming nod. No hesitation. No remorse. Just the quiet, devastating reinforcement of his verdict. A strange calm washed over me. It wasn't numbness. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes after a lightning strike has illuminated a dark landscape. The hope I had carried for so long, the foolish, persistent hope that they would one day understand, died. And in its place, something new and hard and quiet began to grow. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply stood up, my movements feeling slow and deliberate. I pushed my chair neatly under the table. I picked up my worn canvas bag and my car keys from the counter. I looked at them one last time, these two people who had given me life but had refused to let me live it. Okay, I said. The word was barely a whisper, but it felt like the heaviest thing I had ever lifted. I walked out the door and didn't look back. I didn't hear them laugh, but I felt the weight of their judgment follow me out into the cold, damp night. As I drove away from the warm yellow light of their house, I knew I wasn't leaving in shame. I was leaving to save myself. I was driving toward the life I had built in silence, a life they had just declared make-believe. But I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it was the most real thing I had. The drive from Renton to the Bainbridge Island ferry terminal is about 30 minutes without traffic. That night, it felt like a journey across an ocean. Each mile I put between myself and that house, I felt a layer of old heavy skin shedding. The anger was there, a hot coal in my gut, but beneath it was a profound, aching grief for the family I wished I had. The ferry ride was a balm. I got out of my car and stood on the deck, letting the cold, salty wind whip through my hair. The Seattle skyline glittered across the dark water of the Puget Sound, a constellation of man-made stars. It was a city of dreamers, of builders, of people who had come from all over the world to create something from nothing. It was my city. And as the ferry chugged toward the dark, tree-lined silhouette of the island, I felt a sense of coming home that I had never felt in the house I grew up in. My sanctuary wasn't a mansion. It was a small modern cabin I'd had built on a half-acre of land I'd bought with the first significant check from a freelance project. It was tucked away in a forest of Douglas fir and cedar, with a wall of windows that looked out over the Sound. It was my secret, my haven. I had furnished it simply with second-hand furniture I'd refinished myself and shelves overflowing with books. It was a house built not with money, but with intention. It was a space where my soul could breathe. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet healing and furious work. The seed money from my investors, a Portland-based firm called Cascade Ventures, meant I could finally bring my team on full-time. There were 4 of us. Liam, a coding prodigy with a dry wit who I'd collaborated with for years. Maya, a user experience designer whose empathy was her superpower. And Ben, a quiet, steady marketing guru who believed in our mission as much as I did. We worked out of a small rented office space in Seattle's Fremont neighborhood, the self-proclaimed center of the universe. The ferry commute became my daily ritual, a sacred time for reflection. In the morning, I would watch the sun rise over the Cascade Mountains, sipping coffee and mapping out my day. In the evening, I would watch the city lights recede, leaving the day's stress behind on the mainland. My company, Viridian Dynamics, was more than a business to me. It was an act of faith. The platform, which we called Artisan's Bridge, was designed to empower small-scale creators. Potters from Whidbey Island, weavers from the Appalachian Mountains, woodworkers from rural Oregon. We gave them the tools to build beautiful online storefronts, manage inventory, and handle global shipping, all while telling the story of their craft. We took a much smaller commission than the e-commerce giants, and we focused on community and sustainability. We were building an alternative to the soulless, mass-produced world, one handcrafted bowl at a time. It was working. Our user base was growing organically through word of mouth. People were hungry for connection, for authenticity. I didn't speak to my family. After that night, a heavy curtain of silence had fallen. I knew they would have called Clara, that she would have told them I was fine. I didn't reach out. The wound was too raw, too deep. I needed the silence to hear my own voice again. And then about 2 months later, on a gray Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, another call from the same number. And another. A knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. Finally, a voicemail notification popped up. I hesitated, then pressed play. Cassie? Oh, thank God. It's your mother. Her voice was thin and frayed, stripped of its usual confident cadence. Sweetheart, please call me. Something's happened. It's your father. Please, we need you. My hand was trembling as I set the phone down. 100 different scenarios flooded my mind, all of them catastrophic. I thought about the way he'd looked that night, his face red with anger. A heart attack? A stroke? Despite everything, a primal fear gripped me. He was my father. I called Clara. She answered on the first ring. What's going on? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She let out a long, weary sigh. It's not what you think. Dad's fine. Physically. She paused. His pension fund, it collapsed. The company that managed it was a sham. It's all gone, Cassie. Everything they saved for 40 years. And they took out a second mortgage on the house a few years ago to help with my down payment, thinking the pension was secure. The bank is calling. They're talking about foreclosure. I sank into my chair, the world tilting on its axis. It wasn't a sudden tragedy. It was a slow, creeping ruin. The very foundation of security my parents had worshipped their entire lives had crumbled into dust. The irony was so bitter it felt like poison. Why are they calling me? I asked, the question hanging in the air between us. Because you're the only one who can help, Clara said, her voice strained. They're desperate. They're ashamed. Dad, he hasn't left the house in a week. Mom just cries. They don't know what to do. And they want me to fix it, I said, not as a question but as a statement. The daughter they had called a deadbeat, a failure. The one whose world was not real. Suddenly, my make-believe world was their only hope for salvation. Cassie, please, Clara begged. I know what they did was unforgivable. But they're our parents. They're scared. I'm scared too, Clara, I whispered, tears finally blurring my vision. I was scared for years, And they never once tried to understand. They just pushed me away. We ended the call with a quiet, unresolved sadness. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, staring out my office window at the ships gliding along the canal. The calls from my mother continued, each voicemail more desperate than the last. They were a frantic chorus of please, and we need you, and it's urgent. I didn't answer. It wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation. I couldn't dive back into their chaos until I had found my own footing. I couldn't save them until I was sure I had saved myself. A few days later, I was on my way back from a yoga class on the island when my phone rang. It was the security guard from the front gate of my small wooded community. Miss Hayes? There's an older couple here. A Mr. and Mrs. Hayes. They say they're your parents. They don't have an appointment. My blood ran cold. They had found me. They had crossed the water, breaching the last line of my defenses. I could picture them there, in their 10-year-old Buick looking lost and out of place amongst the Teslas and Priuses of my neighbors. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and focused on the feeling of the solid ground beneath my feet. I had a choice. I could let them in, let the storm of their desperation and unacknowledged guilt wash over my carefully constructed peace. Or I could hold my ground. Thank you, David, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. Please inform them that I'm not available. And let them know that this is a private community, and access is for residents and approved guests only. Will do, Ms. Hayes. I hung up and sat in my car for a long time, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It felt both cruel and necessary, like setting a broken bone. Later, I pulled up the security footage on my phone. The image was grainy, but I could see them clearly. My father, pacing back and forth, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. He looked smaller, diminished. My mother stood by the car, twisting the strap of her purse, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She hadn't earned those tears. Tears of remorse, maybe, but not these tears of self-pity. They looked around at the towering trees and the modern architect-designed homes, and their faces were a mixture of awe and bewilderment. They were strangers in the world I had built, a world they never believed I was capable of even imagining. That night, my father sent me a text. It was the first direct communication from him since that night. We are in trouble. We need your help. Just a loan to get us through. I stared at the words on the screen. Just a loan. So simple. A transaction. A way to solve their problem without having to address the gaping wound between us. It was a request for my money, not for my forgiveness. Not for me. I thought about the years I had spent craving their approval. A simple "we're proud of you." I thought about the sting of his words, "deadbeat dreamer," and my mother's silent assent. And I typed a reply, my fingers moving with a clarity that came from a place of deep, settled pain. What kind of collateral can you offer for a loan? What is your business plan for repayment? It was a cold response. A business response. But they had made it clear that our relationship was no longer one of family, but one of transactions of value. I was showing them, in a language they might finally understand, the value they had refused to see. The three dots appeared and disappeared for a long time. Then nothing. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of stubborn pride. Felt like the silence of shock. The silence of a chess player who has just realized their opponent is playing a completely different game. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet fortitude. I poured myself into my work, finding solace in the clean logic of code and the tangible progress of our platform. We launched a new feature that allowed artisans to host live-streamed workshops, creating a direct, personal connection with their customers. It was a huge success. The buzz around Artisans Bridge was growing. We were mentioned in a few prominent tech blogs, praised for our ethical business model and our commitment to small creators. My life was full, not of the things my parents valued, but of purpose, community, and the deep, quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful. The communication from my family shifted. The desperate voicemails from my mother stopped. Instead, Clara became the reluctant ambassador. "They're really struggling, Cassie," she'd say in our weekly strained phone calls. "Dad is trying to find work, but who's hiring a 65-year-old foreman? Mom is thinking about getting a job at the grocery store. They're going to lose the house. I'm not going to let them be homeless, Clara," I'd say, my voice gentle but firm. But I won't be their safety net. I can't be. Not after they so deliberately cut the rope. So what are you going to do? She'd ask, a hint of her old impatience creeping in. I'm going to do what they should have done for me, I replied. I'm going to offer them a hand up, not a handout. Later that week, I had my lawyer draft a letter. It wasn't from me, but from a financial services firm that I had anonymously endowed. The letter offered my parents pro bono services from a top-tier financial counselor who would help them navigate their debt, explore bankruptcy options if necessary, and create a sustainable budget. It also offered them a grant to cover the cost of a rental apartment for 1 year, contingent upon them completing the financial counseling program. There was no mention of me, no way to trace it back. It was help, stripped of the messy, painful emotions that entangled us. It was an offer of support for their future, not a reward for their past behavior. Clara called me after they received it. They're suspicious, she said. Dad thinks it's some kind of scam. Then they are free to decline it, I said calmly. Cassie, why can't you just write them a check? It would be so much easier. Easier for who, Clara? I asked. It wouldn't be easier for me. It would feel like I was paying them to absolve them of what they did. It would reset everything back to the old dynamic, where my worth is tied to what I can provide them. I'm not doing that. They have to choose to rebuild their own lives. I'm just giving them the tools. They eventually, reluctantly, accepted the offer. The foreclosure was halted. They met with the counselor. And a fragile, uncertain quiet settled over us. It was during this quiet period that the article came out. It wasn't in a flashy business magazine, but in GeekWire, Seattle's most respected technology journal. The headline was, "The Quiet Revolution of Artisans Bridge: How Cassandra Hayes is Building a More Human Internet." The journalist had focused on our mission, on the stories of the artisans we'd helped. The photo they used was one my friend had taken. I was standing on the rocky beach near my home, my back to the camera, looking out at the water as the sun set. I was a silhouette against the vast, beautiful landscape. The article was a testament to the work, not to the wealth. It was about the why, not the how much. But of course it mentioned the success. It mentioned our growing valuation. A modest but solid $25 million. It mentioned my role as founder and CEO. And it painted a picture of a life of quiet, intentional success. The fallout was immediate. My inbox flooded with messages from old classmates and former colleagues. But the most significant impact was, of course, at home. Clara sent me a screenshot of a text from our mother. "Did you see this? Your sister is telling the whole world about her business. Why would she do that? Now everyone at church will be asking questions. It's so embarrassing." I stared at the text, a familiar ache blooming in my chest. Embarrassing. My success wasn't a source of pride for them. It was a source of shame. It highlighted their own failure, their own spectacular misjudgment. It was a public record of how wrong they had been. That evening, I hosted a small gathering at my cabin. It wasn't a celebration of the article, but a thank you to my team, Liam, Maya, and Ben, and to the small circle of friends who had been my anchors. We sat around a fire pit on my deck, the stars brilliant in the clear island sky. We drank local wine and ate pizza from a place down the road. "You know," Maya said, her face illuminated by the flickering flames, "my parents were the same way. They wanted me to be a doctor. When I told them I was going into design, they told me I'd be a starving artist. It took them years to understand." Liam nodded. "Mine just wanted me to get a job at Microsoft. A safe corporate gig. They still think what we do is basically magic." We went around the circle and I realized that my story wasn't unique. It was the timeless story of generational divides, of parents whose love is tangled up in fear, of children who have to break away to find themselves. The shame I had carried for so long began to feel less like a personal failing and more like a shared burden. As the evening wound down, my closest friend, a woman named Sarah who I'd known since my first day in that tiny Capitol Hill apartment, put her arm around me. "Have you thought about what comes next?" she asked quietly. "With them." "I think about it all the time," I confessed. "I feel like I'm standing on one side of a deep canyon. I've sent a rope across, but I don't know if they'll ever be willing or able to pull themselves over. And I know I can't go back to their side." "Maybe," she said, looking into the fire. It's not about them coming to your side or you going to theirs. Maybe it's about building a bridge, somewhere in the middle. Her words stayed with me long after everyone had gone home. A bridge. What would a bridge even look like? The bridge began with a letter. It arrived a week after the article, a simple white envelope with my father's blocky, unfamiliar handwriting. It wasn't a text. It wasn't a demand. It was a letter. I left it on my kitchen counter for a full day, afraid of what it might contain. Finally, with a deep breath, I opened it. The letter was short, just a few lines on a single sheet of paper. Cassandra, we read the story. Your mother and I have been talking. We were wrong. Not just about your work, but about everything. We let our fear speak louder than our love. We are sorry for the words we said and for the pain we caused you. We don't expect you to forgive us, but we wanted you to know that we are proud of you. Dad. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, the tears I had held back for so long finally falling hot and silent onto the page. Proud of you. The 3 words I had spent my entire life trying to earn. And here they were, not because I had rescued them, not because I had given them money, but because they had finally seen me. Maybe not fully, maybe not perfectly, but they were trying. The financial counseling was working. They had sold the house in Renton, the house that had become a monument to their fears, and moved into a small, manageable apartment that the grant covered. My father had found a part-time job at a local hardware store, where he could talk to people about tools and projects. My mother had started volunteering at the library. They were smaller, quieter lives, but they were their own. They were rebuilding. I didn't reply to the letter right away. I let the words settle. I let my own heart settle. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't a single event. It was a process, like the turning of the tide. Some days the water was high, the hurt still close to the surface. Other days it receded, leaving behind a smooth, clean shore. A month later, on a bright, sunny Saturday, I drove to the mainland. I didn't go to their apartment. Instead, I asked them to meet me at the Washington Park Arboretum, a vast, beautiful oasis of trees and trails on the shores of Lake Washington. It was neutral ground. It was a place of quiet living things. I saw them waiting for me on a bench near the water. They both looked older, their faces etched with lines of worry and regret, but also with a new kind of peace. My mother wore a simple dress. My father a polo shirt and slacks. There was no pretense between us anymore. Hi, I said, my voice a little shaky. Hi, Cassie, my mother said, giving me a small, tentative smile. We didn't talk about the money or the house or the article. We walked. We walked along the winding paths, under the shade of ancient oaks and maples. My father, an avid gardener in his younger years, pointed out different species of trees. My mother asked about my cabin, about the ferry, about my team. The conversation was stilted at first, full of careful spaces, but slowly it began to flow. We stopped at a quiet spot overlooking the water. For a long time none of us spoke. The financial counselor you sent, my father began, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't look at me but at the water. He's a good man. He's helping us see a different way. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We never understood your world, Cassie, my mother said, her eyes welling with tears. This time they felt real. And because we didn't understand it, we were afraid of it. We thought we were protecting you, but we were just suffocating you. I know, I said softly. My father finally turned to look at me, his gaze direct and full of a pain that mirrored my own. Can a person get a second chance to be a good father? He asked, his voice cracking. And in that moment, standing on that neutral ground, surrounded by the quiet, resilient life of the forest, I felt the last of the anger, the last of the deep, bitter hurt, finally dissolve. It left behind a quiet, tender space. I think so, I said, a real smile touching my lips for the first time. I think everyone deserves a second chance to try. It wasn't a magical fix. It wasn't an erasure of the past. The scars were still there, faint white lines on our hearts. But it was a beginning. It was the first stone laid for a bridge, built not on obligation or guilt, but on the fragile, hopeful ground of forgiveness. We stood there for a while longer, the 3 of us, a broken family learning to piece itself back together in a new shape. The path forward was uncertain. The bridge was still under construction, and it would take time and effort from all of us to make it strong. But as I looked from my parents' faces to the sunlight dancing on the water, I felt a quiet, profound hope. I had walked through the fire and come out whole on the other side. I had built a life of my own, a sanctuary of my own. And now maybe, just maybe, I could finally build a doorway in that sanctuary, one just big enough to let the light and my family back in.